Now, the Nigerian government has proposed a budget of just over 26 trillion naira for the year 2024. The proposed budget comes as the Federal Executive Council has also approved the borrowing of $1.5 billion from the World Bank to support key policy reforms. The Tinubu-led government has been taking steps to boost economic growth, including scrapping petrol subsidy and lifting foreign exchange trading restrictions. However, these actions have worsened already record-high double-digit inflation, fueling anger and frustration for a population grappling with a cost of living crisis. The country is also targeting oil production of 1.78 million barrels per day under the 2024 spending plan, while governments will set aside 8.25 trillion naira for debt servicing and 7.78 trillion naira to cover salaries and pensions for civil servants. Gospel Obele, Chief Economist for Streetnomics, joins me again, a friend of the house. Gospel, it's good to see you again.
Thank you for having me. Great to speak with you again, Tolu.
So while we have a general idea of the overall cost of this budget, we know that, of course, the details will trickle in the coming days. This is the first budget coming from the Tinubu administration. And we can definitely see an increase on the last budget of the Buhari administration, which was worth around 21.83 trillion naira. So in terms of what we see from the movements of the Tinubu administration, the current situation of Nigeria as it stands, what do you make of this figure? A reasonable one, considering the current economic climate and government reforms and revenue, of course, or are we shooting in the dark here because we just don't have at least a little bit more detail?
Well, it's fairly reasonable. I use the word fairly reasonable because in the ideal sense of things, I mean, the Nigerian economy is a very large and complex economy, and we need a very massive investment drive to unlock lots of its prospects. And that's taking every other thing else constant. You know, the challenges we have, the quality of public leadership, taking everything else constant. We need loads and loads of investment drive to unlock the potential of the Nigerian economy. So when you talk about investment, public finance that goes into the mainstream sectors, unlocking for growth and prosperity, you need a whole lot more. I mean, 26 trillion is just less than 1/3 of the brand value of Apple globally. So that's to tell you that our budget is still very relatively small in context to the investment and traction we need to be generating. So technically, the arguments and conversations that have been going on has been, very much safety is what myopic, in context to where we are right now as a budget size, looking at a nation that really wants to compete in the bigger context of things in the continent and globally.
So the context we do have particularly concerns crude oil production as well as pegging the Naira, the exchange rate. So let's look at that because Finance Minister and the Coordinating Minister of the Economy, Wale Edun, mentioned assumptions about a reference price for crude oil at about $73.96 per barrel. Looking at the trend with global crude oil prices, many had expected that it would hit $100 recently. We're just around that 90-something dollar mark as it is right now. Is Nigeria playing too safe with the crude oil pegging we have, or could we have gone a bit higher with our expectations for 2024?
I mean, it's again relatively reasonable, relatively because there are many events that are evolving right now in the world, especially on the geopolitical side, that will really inform the price of oil in the coming months. The recent Israel-Hamas war, even the Russia-Ukraine war. So there are lots of moving political tensions, and just yesterday, the Russian president was in China to facilitate conversations on other levels of investment and all that. So we don't really know what the future of geopolitical geopolitical narratives are, but we know that they tend to be more high risk, that based upon the events we've seen recently. So the argument then again is how will all of these events impact on the oil price in the future? So there are possibilities that the price will go up. But then again, I say relatively okay because what would then be a safer place to pitch our budgetary assumption. And let's not forget that all of these assumptions are built on the fact that almost 85 to 90% of our revenue proceeds in terms of FX comes from oil. All right. So again, my expectation, or if at all we plan to really take things seriously, in Nigeria, will be how do we begin to organize the non-oil sector for productive revenue mobilization, as it were, and then begin to pitch that going forward in terms of our assumption list so that we are not just hinged only on what the oil price dictates to us, and all of that. So right now, based on how the Nigerian economy is structured and running, even with the new presidency, you still see that there is need for us to review our terms of engagement, how we are working assumptions for our budget, if truly we want to break out and do well for ourselves as a nation in terms of prosperity. So I would also want to challenge the executives to think outside the box of oil, to ask ourselves what are major unconventional but existing low-hanging fruits in all our space that we can also factor into our assumption, but then again, working backwards to ensure there's a productive revenue mobilization from that bit.
It's a very big issue that Nigeria continues to face when it comes to crude oil, because it's such a major player or revenue earner for the country. So another thing we can talk about is the fact that we know that the budget proposal is also pegging the exchange rate at 700 Naira to the dollar. And the FX situation is one that has been and will continue to dominate conversations for some time. We've seen the Naira cross over the 1,000 Naira mark recently as well. In terms of this particular pegging of the Naira to the dollar, how realistic is it? Because it will affect the estimates that the government is able to put forth for revenue generation, debt servicing, and every other thing going forward.
I mean, so to say, when pegs happen, I mean, it's such that those pegs are to inform the baseline expectations, based upon how the budget is built. So if you say 700, does not necessarily mean that, we're capping at that. But I want to also believe that there are room for flexibility in terms of how markets are working and where we are currently with the exchange. So, safe to say as well that 700 does not really cut it in terms of reality. But I want to take it that's baseline figures, to drive the pegging and building of the budget. And that's because there are many, many more events that are unfolding, and we really don't have a plan to bring down the value of the exchange. Again, because in my simple opinion, having a plan to bring down the exchange in terms of how much the Naira exchange to the dollar is really hinged on first having a productive economy in lockdown. Have a productive economy. Then you can begin to think of institutionalizing those policies on how you manage the exchange, especially in context to how global monetary exchange rates or financial services, and even central banking is evolving. So you need to put into context everything to ask ourselves, where would the value of the Naira be in context to what we are doing right now? All right. So if you look at all these moving parts, to tell you that we're not realistic with that 700, loads and loads of events are shaping. However, top of the mind, low-hanging fruit / win is the fact that you have a new central bank governor who's got the professional expertise, as well as has a very good professional relationship with the fiscal authority. So that is a lot of leverage that can help us really, really navigate where the value of Naira should be pitched at, based off on, productivity dynamics, good structural reforms and all of that. So if we put all these things together, we expect that there should be some very good prospects if we go in that direction. But pegging at 700, I just want to assume that's baseline pegging, because if that's top line pegging, that would be a very big problem in the future.
So this is going to lead me to ask what you think about some of the recent moves concerning the Naira, and if you think that we're starting to see success from those moves, or it's still a bit early to call. So of course we know that the minister, when he was standing before the Senate, when he was trying to be confirmed, he made mention of the fact that there's about probably a $10 million backlog when it comes to Forex money and money that needs to be paid out. Yeah. Then, of course, this recent move to lift Forex restrictions on 43 items as well, and a number of other things, just making sure they're trying to harmonize the exchange rates, floating, quotes, a managed float of the Naira. We're seeing some of these done in the past 1-2 months, in the past few weeks. Are we starting to gain some momentum from these moves?
So on one hand, I agree with you, it's early to tell, but some very basic things are at stake here. So that would inform our projections. So take, for instance, you cannot harmonize the Nigerian exchange rates the way it is right now. You can't have one market. That's the truth. So having one market also involves you bringing in the parallel market. All right. So the so-called parallel, disorganized and unstructured market has to be factored in if there's going to be any harmonization in the future. So trying to harmonize as a decision or one policy just to get everybody in one block is not going to work. It's not possible. All right. So there has to be an unconventional strategy to involve the parallel market stakeholders, because their bulk of demand side activities that inform the exchange in that market and goes a long way over time to stretch the exchange in the interbank or in the official window. All right. So that's number one. Number two is the fact that with the release of these for three ban items and all that, which was one of the major issues, policies that led to what we are today, it's sort of also reinforcing the market for demand. So the demand side market has already been stretched, and this 43 items lifting is a good policy, but you also need to now make the provision for it. Because either ways now markets have sort of found a middle ground. So what I mean by middle ground is when that policy was initially banned, when it was banned by the previous central bank governor, it technically did not mean that FX was not flowing to those markets to import those items. It just meant that they were happening more in the dark market than the visible market. So that's what it means. But right now, the dark market and the visible market have sort of infused in a very interesting way that even lifting of the ban will still, bring about hike in demand for FX. It's just that right now it's happening more in the open than the dark market. All right. So if you look at all these evolving narratives, it just means that we now need to work double or triple or quadruple the time in terms of policy efforts and all that to put in the right structural measures to ensure that the value of the Nigerian currency takes off. Mm-hmm. And that's hinged on productivity dynamics. Productivity dynamics is largely hinged on leveraging on a low-hanging fruit like the service sector, to rake in more FX. And once those FX are being raked in, then you now begin to, you should have a backup plan in terms of how do you want to link up the official window and the parallel window so as to facilitate a reasonable, equitable distribution, of FX in the ecosystem, as well as also discouraging demand for it. And when we mean discouraging demand for it, we don't mean introducing policy that will shut off. We mean creating the alternatives. Yes. So take, for instance, locally, you need to fix food supply. When you fix food supply at the quality and quantity, then you begin to grow that made in Nigeria, block, and you begin to reduce imported food inflation dynamics and all that. So there are a lot of moving parts to this thing, but I do not think that one of, trying to rewrite policy efforts will work it.
All right, so let's look at what else we're gleaming from the budget proposal. So it was announced, and then this is also coming as Nigerians are also hearing that the country wants to borrow $1.5 billion from the World Bank, and that's to provide financing, of course, at the request of the government to support key policy reforms. Now, Mr. Edun said that the World Bank has agreed to process the concessionary financing and that the economy is also expected to grow at a rate of about 3.76% next year. So let's put some of these numbers together. So we want to borrow 1.5 billion naira, billion dollars from the World Bank for key economic reforms or key policy reforms. But we also have a GDP growth rate of 3.76% for next year. Inflation right now currently is at 20-year highs. We saw the new inflation rate coming out, 27.72%. It's expected to moderate to about 21% next year. When we look at our total public debt stock as at June 30th, 2023, that was 87.38 trillion naira and about $113.42 billion. So that's from the total domestic and external debts of the federal government, the FCT, the 36 states as well. So when we hear 1.5 is going to be borrowed, and we see a budget that's coming in at 26.01 trillion naira, and then of course we're in the midst of this very, very difficult time economically for many Nigerians, what do we think about what we're borrowing the money for? Key policy reforms, that still doesn't tell us enough. And some of the story right now is that it's being borrowed for palliatives to, of course, increase the conditional cash transfer that the governments have been making in recent years. What do we think about this borrowing now?
Yeah, it's quite scary. Honesty, it's quite scary. And again, big ticket issues on how you want to fund the 26 trillion thereabout Naira budget. So how do you want to fund that? Plus the fact that you're borrowing. So, and again, the government already knows that the people are kicking strongly against borrowing, and there are lots of kickbacks against borrowing. So you would start hearing narratives on palliatives and all that. The borrowing is not the problem, like we've always said. It's what you've been borrowing for. But secondly, if you're borrowing to support palliative programs and all that, then the intervention has to be very strategic, and it has to link up to a core policy structure that has a sustainable pathway to lift people out of poverty. That's the only way the borrowing can make sense. That's just the only way the borrowing can make sense. So I don't think as of now, I genuinely think that 3.7% is too optimistic growth rate for next year, because there is so much events in the world today that are shaping low growth, and reinforcing low growth, like the new emerging geopolitical conversations. And we heard the IMF and the World Bank leads, talk about the fact that interest rates will continue to go up till next year. So how do you want to achieve all of these dynamics again in context to inflation? So borrowing such amount of money for palliative will be a wasteful investment if you don't rework the intervention cycle to be such that it sits heavily on the key investment and sectoral drivers that would, have that sustainable pathway towards prosperity. So it's a very mixed scenario, because even right now, the Nigerian government does not have the revenue capabilities to fund many of its aspirations, even many of its intervention and support programs at a very basic level. It doesn't have the money. So there is that push to look on the external. Either ways you want to look at it. Again, with the rising budget deficit we're going to be faced with in 2024, there's that push to look at the external. So how are you looking at that external and linking back to your local economy, key drivers to build for sustainability? Those are the very big questions we have right now. But the current state of play, I do not think is wise or makes any sense to invest that kind of money in palliative structure. Because palliative in themselves have not proven to be very intelligent social intervention programs to reduce the cost of living crisis.
And I'll finally ask you this, because as I said earlier, we're still waiting for more breakdowns that will give us an idea of the direction that the Tinubu administration particularly wants to go. But I think we're seeing some of that when it comes to the monetary decisions being made and then the decisions around palliatives. But we still have the health sector, we have education, we have security, which continue to be overwhelming needs. And when you look at the trend for Nigerian budgets in the past few years, education and health oftentimes do not get, probably, let's say, the due amount that they're due. We see a lot of money being funneled into security, of course, with Nigeria's multidimensional security issues. But we need to see health, we need to see education, and even the allocation or the budgets, line item budget that goes for the National Assembly always becomes something of a controversy. So what are you expecting from the Tinubu administration? If we take some of the comments of the president during the time that he was campaigning, his manifesto that was released, and even looking at some of the actions we've seen in the few months that he has been president, would you look into your crystal ball and give me an idea where you think he might be going when it comes to many of the individual sectors when it comes to this budget?
So I've got very mixed opinion about it. So number one, in terms of the presidency itself, he's arming himself with people who can actually do the work. My worry is if the people have the right lens to the problem. So we have ideas on how to fix it, but do you have the right lens to what the problem is in the first place? So that the ideas and solutions you have are very context fit to the problem. And that's to say, pick education, for instance. The way we need to model education to work in the South may have to be different from how we model it to work in the North. The way you model JAMB to work in the South, it may have to be different from how you model it to work in the North. All right. So our social complexities or our cultural complexities have also informed how we may need to think about reforms going forward. So we need to ask the right questions, have the lens to the right, to have the right lens to the problems and all that. And if you look at this chain of arguments, that then informs that over the years, even if you want to say, oh, about 8% has been invested into education and all that, we need to increase the money. I don't think the argument really is increasing the money, because if you ask them to increase the size, that may be a bigger problem for the government. However, even the 8% itself, has it been channeled according to the right interventions, which has been built on the right solutions that fit into context? That's the very big question that many stakeholders are not asking. So there is that push to say, okay, let's just increase the budget. But even if you increase the budget size and you fund education on the grounds of policies that don't work, then it will keep failing. The sector will keep failing. All right. So look at security, for instance. I mean, in all sorts of meetings, I can't really definitely say this is the percentage share, but even with how much we're investing into security, look at how insecure the country has been increasingly over the couple of years, leading up until now. So even if you increase the budget size for education, it may not necessarily make a difference. You may just have more noise, but maybe lesser impact. Because the problem or challenge we're faced with, reform structurally wise, are very contextually driven. All right. So even with your 8%, you can still achieve so much more than we're achieving now. All right. So such that when you achieve so much more, fitting into context, you can then increase the budget and you scale the impact. So I think the arguments of both sides, in as much as I agree for an increased budgetary allocation, I would rather argue more for our policy reforms, our structure and all that to be more contextually fit. All right. So take for instance now, why can't we teach English, general mathematics in Hausa, in a state like Plateau State than in Lagos? All right. Why should it be one general mathematics structure text across the 36 states of the Federation? All right. So you need to remodel the order of education, and that remodeling should have its own refinancing of some sort. And when you begin to match it correctly, we begin to see the results we've been aspired to see. And then the argument to increase budgetary allocation can be really valid and may actually make some sense when you put in those new monies into a system that's already working.
All right, it's Gospel Obele, Chief Economist for Streetnomics. Thank you as always for joining me. We're expecting to see more details of this 26.01 trillion Naira budget, and we'll of course break it down sector by sector in the coming days. Thank you so much.
Looking forward. Thank you for having me.
All right. And just a quick reminder of what that proposed budget looks like, if we can get it back. Right now, the details we know, of course, revolve around crude oil production as well as the pegging of the Naira. So very quickly, we're looking at the Tinubu administration looking to spend 26.01 trillion Naira, of course, with the oil price set at $73.96 for expenditures, and of course 700 Naira per dollar. And then we're also targeting a 1.78 million barrels per day of oil production under the 2024 spending plan. You're watching Business Edge. We're going out for headlines. We have international headlines coming up after the break. And of course, we'll be in West Africa's second largest economy as we look at the ongoing restructuring conversation. Stay with us.